Good day. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Creation Talk. My name is Joe Tay, and joining me is Dr. Jonathan Safferty from a remote location. As you can see, I'm here alone in our studio. So, Dr. Safferty, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, I believe we're going to talk about something that's actually quite close to my heart, you might say, is how did Noah fit all the animals on the ark?
Yes, that's interesting. In fact, I have to address something similar during my talks on dinosaurs. And today we're not just talking about dinosaurs, but a similar objection that somebody will always come up to me and say, how can dinosaurs fit on the ark? It's the same thing. How can the animals fit on the ark? And when they raise this objection, I always turn around and I ask them a series of questions. I say, can you tell me how many animals were there? How many dinosaurs were there? What was the average size of an animal? How do they keep these animals on board the ark? And they always turn around and they say that they do not know.
And so also, how big was the ark? I mean, the ark was too small for all the animals. Okay, how big was it, do you think? Oh, I don't know. It must have been too small. Got no clue about what size it was, but it must be too small, yeah.
Yeah, so I turned the question back on them and I show that if you cannot answer these questions, how can you say that animals can't be on the ark? But I think we actually can answer these questions, and I think that's what we would like to explore today.
Yeah, a bit of historical background. I might just say that it was only the second article I ever wrote for Creation magazine was called How Did All the Animals Fit on Noah's Ark? And that was a quarter century ago. My second article I ever wrote for Creation magazine.
So what kind of animals did Noah have to bring on board the ark?
Well, it's a case of looking at the biblical account. It says that all kinds of land vertebrate animals, animals with a backbone, so no congressman allowed. Also, all kinds of birds. But the thing is, later on we see that all that breathe through nostrils outside the ark perished, which implies that only things that had nostrils were brought on the ark, which means no insects, because insects don't have nostrils. They breathe through holes in the skin called spiracles through tracheae. So no insects. That's why I'm saying it's land vertebrate animals. No fish, no whales, also no plants, and no invertebrates. They could have been stowaways, but they weren't obligate passengers.
Let's say the penguin. Will you say they were on the ark, or you would not know? Or what do you think?
I think it's a very fine, but we could probably fit the penguin on if we had to. I'm not sure about that one. I mean, there might be some things which are a leeway. I don't think they had to be on, but maybe they were. I don't think it's going to matter too much compared to the vast number of animals we're talking about.
Okay, so at the very least, we know that the Bible is clear. If they breathe air through their nostrils and they're land creatures, they have to be on the ark.
Which is land vertebrates, yes.
Okay, all right. And the Bible talks about created kinds, and what's that? How does that relate to the creatures on the ark?
Well, you might say, I think we've done videos on these before, which we can put in the show notes below the video about kinds versus species, the fact that the kind is much broader than what's now called a species, even though the kind would originally have been a single species, but now many species, probably many genera. A genera is the next level above a species, so probably I think all of us think that in most cases the kind is equivalent to a family, but that's a sort of rule of thumb, not a hard and fast rule.
Okay, so it's just a classification system. I think in Genesis 1, the Bible tells us that God created the creatures to reproduce after their own kind.
Yes.
I think around 10 times or so in Genesis 1. So we already said that these are creatures with a backbone, vertebrate creatures that were on board the ark. So the insects like beetles and things like that, how would they have survived the flood?
Well, I mean, when we think about what the flood would do, it also rip up lots of vegetation rafts. That's one thing, and they can persist for a long time. It's interesting that Darwin himself did experiments. He floated some things on driftwood for months on end just to show that he was trying to prove that things could get from South America to Galapagos by floating on things. But in fact, he was also inadvertently supporting the flood account. He also submerged seeds in salt water for months and found they could still germinate. Again, he wasn't trying to prove the flood account, he was trying to prove a migration account, but that's consistent with the biblical account of landing on Ararat and dispersing. We would have accepted the same sort of things he was talking about.
And this was Charles Darwin who said that?
Because he was trying to attack the Lyellian view called fixity of species, which says that species don't change, and also Lyell thought that species were created in their current locations. Now, that's not biblical, because we believe that species varied and also migrated from Ararat to the current location. So again, his experiments do support what the flood account says.
So it's interesting because skeptics turn around and say, oh, you creationists will come out with all these kind of floating rough ideas and things. But it seems that Darwin was the one himself who mentioned some of this.
Right, and also pumice is another idea. I mean, the book called Noah's Ark, a feasibility study by John Woodmore, he talks about pumice produced by the volcanic eruptions, and pumice floats as well. And that could have supported a lot of different things, seeds and insects.
Okay, so only the vertebrate creatures were on board the ark.
As passengers, yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned that's maybe somewhere between the created kind would be somewhere between what we call a family or even a genre. So how many creatures would that be?
Well, I think not as many as people think. I mean, because most of it, when they talk about millions of species, a lot of them are plants, a lot of them are marine creatures, a lot of them are insects, and that's not relevant for what we are talking about. So the number of land vertebrates is a lot smaller. I mean, in fact, John Woodmore was generous. He assumed that the kind was a genus, in which case he calculated about 16,000 animals max would be on board. If the kind was about a family, probably about 2,000 animals max were on board.
So 2,000 to 16,000 animals, and that's all. Okay.
That's all, yeah.
So what about dinosaurs? Aren't they too big to have them on board the ark?
Well, first of all, how big was the ark is the other question to answer, isn't it? So.
Oh yeah. So how big was it then?
Well, the Bible tells us 300 cubits. This is a cubit. Cubit is Latin for elbow. Now, if you get a blood draw from here, this is called the cubital fossa. Okay, just a bit of useless information for you. So 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide. Now let's take a cubit of 18 inches. Mine's about 19 inches. Okay.
Yes.
But let's take it 18 inches to be conservative, and you think it's actually longer than a football field, and it's wide enough to block 6 lanes of the U.S. interstate system.
Yes.
And would it be as high as a 4-story building?
Yes, that's
pretty
right.
Big.
It's massive. Yes. In fact, the storage capacity would be, how much was it again? Like 522 railroad cars. But I guess it depends on who you ask, right?
Well, I think that's about the standard, the sort of standard US railroad stock car. That would be 522. I've also calculated as a standard semi-trailer size. The semi-trailer is about 300 times the size, 340 times the size of the semi-trailer carrying capacity. Because I think people are familiar with those, because you're on the road, they're blocking all lanes. They're not supposed to be in the left lane, they do anyway, okay? And they block off you can't see the signs because they're so big. They're really big. You can see that when you're driving, but the ark is 340 times the carrying capacity.
Yeah, sometimes when I'm speaking on this topic, one illustration I say that if you want to imagine 522, next time you're driving, you're waiting for a train to pass by, imagine waiting for 522 carriages. And when people realize how long that would take, that really gives them an idea of how big the ark was.
Or you could say that there's 6 lanes of semi-trailers, about half a mile long each. Okay, that's the other way of putting it. Yeah.
Yes. Wow, that's big. Yeah.
Yeah. So both of those are big. Either way, it shows you how huge the thing was.
Yeah. So, Jonah, how many dinosaurs were there on the ark?
Well, that depends again on who you ask, because I think when we were trying to work out the created kinds of dinosaurs, we assumed again the kind was the size of a family, but it might have been the size of a superfamily, sometimes maybe even a suborder. Like I think all the horned dinosaurs, I mean, some evolutionists have said it's got basically one chassis with different head ornaments, basically something on those lines. So were they all one kind of horned dinosaur with different varieties of horns? Okay, so maybe 50 or so dinosaur kinds might be, but even if there are more, Woodmore again counts dinosaur genera and still finds a way of fitting them on the ark.
So, Jono, so you said there's about 50 to 60 kind of dinosaurs, so that's about 100 to 120 dinosaurs on the ark.
Right.
But wouldn't they still be too big? I mean, how big were these creatures?
Oh, some of them were really massive for sure, the biggest land creatures of all time. But where does it say that Noah had to take on the full-grown ones? It doesn't say that.
So he could doing them when they're smaller in size or younger.
Well, it's interesting that sort of since I wrote my first article, they've done studies on the dinosaur bones. For a long time, these bone fossils were precious. No one wanted to drill into them. But Dr. Jack Horner, he owned some dinosaur fossils, so he was allowed to drill into his own specimens, and he found he could tell the difference between growing bone and sort of a mature bone was much denser. And he showed that dinosaurs change shape when they grew. So obviously one issue is that some dinosaurs which have different names are actually baby versions of other ones. So that's again cutting down the number of kinds we've got there. But also studies on the rings show growth rings. So they could tell that dinosaurs all had this pattern. They started off growing slowly, and then they shot up as a teenager, adolescent, and then they leveled off. So I think if God brought the animals to Noah, like it says in Genesis 6:20, I think he would have brought them on a year before they went through their growth spurt.
Oh, yes, at least when they're much smaller in size, I guess.
We've got one graph in one of our articles about, which we'll show you, that the Apatosaurus might be 30 tons fully grown, but was only 1 ton when he's about 4 years old, and 1 ton 5 years old. Yes. And after about 5 years old, it started to go through its growth spurt really, really fast. You're talking about 5.5 tons a year. That's how fast this thing grew in its adolescent growth spurt. So if you took it on when it's only 1 ton, it's a much smaller animal. And same with all the other things. All the other dinosaurs had the same sort of growth pattern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yes, that's true, because I think even the big dinosaurs would have to come from an egg, right, about the size of a football.
Yes, we know that from we've found eggs that way. Some are a bit longer, but they're still sort of that football.
About the same size.
But then again, you can't get thicker, because how do you get air into the embryo? The embryo has to breathe. Air gets through the porous shell. The bigger the egg, the thicker the shell. You get to a point where it's too thick to let air in. So there's a limit to how big an egg can be.
Yes, I think the big titanosaurs would be, when you were a baby, fresh out of the egg will be about 15 inches, and that's about the maximum size they would get.
I think 15 inches, so let them grow till they're 1 ton in weight, and then God brings those specimens on a year before their growth spurt again.
Mm-hmm. And more than enough space, yeah. So, but how would the 8 people that were on board the ark, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, 3 wives, 8 of them, how would they care for all these creatures? I mean, even if we have 2,000 to 16,000 animals, isn't that a lot of work?
Well, I mean, farmers have always had been outnumbered greatly by the animals under their care. Even when they bring them in over the winter to shelter them, they've always been outnumbered by the animals long before there's modern technology available. So they've long known about things that could keep animals over winter, like as a deep litter system. We keep on putting on litter or peat moss and things, and just keep on piling up, so it absorbs all the waste products. And they've found that this deep litter system doesn't smell until you have to wash it out after the winter's over. That's when it starts to pong, okay? But while it's in use, it's actually fairly hygienic. The Dutch farmers have a name for it called potstal.
Yes, potstal, yes, that's right. And a potstal is just a system where they throw straw and hay over the waste, and just let it pile up.
Yeah.
And I think on the website, on the article on the website, did you write it? Where you will say that it would be about 0.5 meter tall after one season?
It actually gets really tall, yeah.
But then we just clear it out.
But again, it's a very low maintenance sort of system. You do it every so often, but it's also low maintenance. Another system, you've got slatted or sloped floors. I mean, I lived in New Zealand for most of my life, for at least half my life. And of course, we're very familiar with sheep, because sheep outnumber people in New Zealand by a big margin. Okay, so they would keep sheep, when they're sharing them, they actually had slatted floors, so all the waste could actually go through and be collected below, but the sheep weren't really in much contact with it, because it went through the slats there, or a slope so it can roll off. Another one is called a gravity drain gutter system.
What's that?
Which you have a gutter which collects all the waste product. They're in a line, and they've got a trough for feeding, and they've got a gutter to collect the waste product. And the Dutch have a name for it called the groepstal. Groep is the old Dutch word for gutters. That's what they call it. But it's a gravity drain gutter system. The gravity pulls it off, and there's a drainage. And once the stuff is drained away, there are ways of getting rid of it, like vermicomposting, which is composting by worms, and the worms could be used as food sources for birds and other things.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I used to do that as a hobby as well, growing earthworms.
Oh, okay. So you're all familiar with vermicomposting then?
Yes, they're in containers, and just a way to get rid of your waste and just produce some fertilizers as well. But what about the water? Doesn't the water, do you have like the gutter system, or how do you think they would have done that?
Again, you see animal feed system where you have a central filling station of grain which goes in from a filling station by gravity into a trough. And same with water from a central filling station into the trough. I don't think it'll take a lot of work to build those things, but once they're in place, they're fairly low maintenance sort of systems.
And the water could come from the rain, so they do not need to store too much water?
I wouldn't have thought so. When you've got 40 days and 40 nights of rain, that's pretty fresh water you're talking about there. So I think that would work.
Here's another challenge. What about the animals that eat meat? How do they survive?
Yeah, well, let's first make it quite clear that meat eating for humans began after the flood when God gave us permission. But clearly, animals must have become carnivorous sometime between the fall and the flood. And we talk about that in Genesis account and in our book, okay? So there were some meat-eating dinosaurs that had to be taken care of. And there are ways of doing it, like drying the meat would preserve and reduce the weight and the volume. And also fodder tortoises, because the Galapagos tortoises were almost wiped out because the whalers would take them on board, they'd turn them upside down so they were helpless, and then they had fresh meat whenever they wanted it. Okay, not very nice for the turtle, but it's a possibility they could use for the carnivores on the ark. And of course, the worms from the vermicomposting could be used to feed quite a lot of things. Yes. Yeah,
so essentially, it shouldn't be hard to take care of all the animals. But what about the plants? How did they survive outside the ark during the flood? Towards the end of the flood, we even read about how Noah sent out a bird and came back with a leaf, right? An olive leaf or something like that. So how would there have been enough time for this plant to have grown and produced leaves?
When you got the vegetation rafts and the pumice and the things that Darwin discovered, you got seeds that would actually germinate as soon as it was suitable to do so. And you have vegetative propagation. Paul uses the olive tree as a metaphor for the Jews and the Gentiles and the place of blessing by grafting.
Yes.
You see, so olives don't have to hatch from seed; they can actually hatch from plants. So that's probably one reason that the olive was the thing that the dove picked out, because it had already sprouted through vegetative propagation, and it's not the only plant that can do it.
Yes, I think, and earlier on in this talk, you mentioned how Darwin actually looked at seeds and that they can actually survive for long periods of time.
Right.
So what about after the flood? What did these carnivores eat?
Well, I think people don't realize that even the hunters would like to have a free meal of something that's already dead, because hunting is risky. It uses energy. You can get hurt by the animal fighting back, but a dead animal doesn't fight back. And so even if it's quite rotten, carnivores will often take that free meal, and there's plenty of dead animals, and you could probably exhume the carrion that have been just recently buried, so plenty of that. And think about when the flood went back off the continent, there'd be some depressions which would trap water, and fish would be trapped in those depressions, and that could leave a whole lot of fish in these pools to be trapped by for the carnivores to eat. That would happen.
I see. So like water sorting action.
Yeah.
What about hibernation? What's that?
Hibernation?
Hibernation, yes. So what has that got to do with the ark?
That was one theory that somehow maybe to save weight that God would actually induce hibernation in the animals, but it doesn't seem to be necessary. It's possible. It could have happened, but it's just that it doesn't seem to be a necessary thing to postulate. It's possible, but just not necessary.
Okay, so even with a hibernation, there should still be enough food. It should still be easy to take care of these animals for the flood.
The hard part was the 70 years of building the ark. That would have been the hard part, and putting all these, not only building the ark, but also the infrastructure to house and to care for them. That was the hard work. Once that was done, it was actually comparatively low maintenance.
It's interesting you mentioned 70 years to build the ark, but I hear some people say 120 years. So which is correct?
Well, it's 120 years. God said that thing in Genesis 6:3 that mankind would have 120 years left, and some people think that's the lifespan. No, it's the time till the judgment of the flood. It can't be lifespan because people lived a long time after 120 years. Even today they do occasionally. Okay, so it's a time to the judgment, but then when God actually gave instructions for the ark, he said it was to house your sons and their wives, which means there must have been time for their sons to not only be born, but to mature and to marry. And so since Noah had his oldest son at 500 years old, that's 100 years before the flood, and then given, say, 30 years for all of them to get married, that's where I get the 70 years from.
So, Jono, I think we have covered most of these questions that we raised earlier on. I think we showed that it's very possible for all the animals to actually fit on the ark. And we have actually addressed all the major objections.
Well, thank you very much for listening to us. Now, do remember that we're only covering scratching the surface when we do a talk like this. Please look at the show notes, the videos, the resources. There's far more than we can possibly talk about in half an hour or less. Also, don't forget to press the like and subscribe buttons below. So, hope you enjoyed the podcast. Do come back for more.